Sophie Hardy and the Internet Implant by Emma Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 6. An Explanation. A few minutes after waking, Sophie was sat up and talking, and her mum and dad had left the room to ring her nan to say that she was okay. She had seen what had happened on the internet and desperately wanted reassurance that what she had seen hadn't done Sophie any harm. Sophie, of course, had no idea what had happened to her. No one could have seen what she had, and she wondered what it must look like to everyone else. Fortunately, now that Mrs. Tabard had gone off with Sophie's parents for a quick chat, and Miss Sissons was stood just outside the classroom door with her arms folded across her chest and her hand over her mouth, clearly contemplating something deep, Sophie was free to share her experience with Yasmin and Katie and find out what they had seen. "What happened?" the three girls all said together. "You first." Sophie got in before anyone else had the chance to speak. Neither of the other two said anything. Katie just walked over to the class computer and loaded up a video site. She clicked on a video and up came a news feed which had been broadcasting the announcement. It clearly showed Sophie being asked to sit down by King and him going to put the machine on Sophie's head. In the process of that happening, someone had shouted and Sophie could make out Miss Sissons trying to get to the front and a few people screaming. When the implantation machine was placed on Sophie's head, she fell off the chair onto the floor. The arms of the machine hadn't turned green or blue like they had with Yasmin and Reuben. They had turned red and green. Sophie lay motionless on the floor and carnage had ensued. Some people were running towards the stage, other people were running from it. Cameramen were refocusing their cameras to get the best shot, and reporters had started to ad-lib what it was that they were seeing for the millions of people watching at home. After that, the video stopped. "Then Mr. Houghton and Miss Sissons carried you in here to get you out of sight," Yasmin explained. "You woke up about half an hour after you blanked out." "Half an hour? It only felt like a few seconds," Sophie replied. "No, we were all sat around for a while waiting for you to come back," Yasmin concluded. Katie hadn't said anything, and while this wasn't unusual for her, Sophie couldn't help but wonder that there might be something a bit more to it. So she asked, "Are you okay?" Katie nodded, not very convincingly. "Sure?" Sophie continued. "You're famous," Katie said rather flippantly. "Pardon?" Sophie replied, adjusting her position so that she was sat at the table like you would expect in a lesson. "Your name and face is all over the internet. The whole world watched you become the third child to get an implant, but the first to have it fail. You're everywhere. All of the press that were outside are now waiting at the school door to get a photo or an interview with you," Katie continued with arms folded. Momentarily forgetting about the Clara situation, a realisation hit Sophie. Of course, she was now known to everyone. The announcement of her name before she went up on stage had made her famous. Now that she'd fainted as well, she would be infamous. The school that she went to, major aspects of her life had been broadcast to everyone. The thought scared Sophie. Yasmin looked like she was staring into space again. She was clearly accessing her implant. "Yes, your name is all over the internet. Major news sites, social media, everywhere. You're the most famous 10-year-old on the planet at the minute." Just then, the classroom door opened and Miss Sissons walked in. She had her arms folded and spoke rather abruptly to the girls. "Girls, give us a minute, please," she said, aiming it at Yasmin and Katie. "But," Yasmin started to say when Miss Sissons gave her a glance that let her know she was serious. She didn't give the look often, normally only when someone had done something outrageous at school, but the girls had seen it before and knew she meant it. Respecting her as they did, the girls hugged Sophie and left. "You need to tell us what's happened to you," Yasmin tried to say, but Miss Sissons closed the door behind them while she was mid-sentence. Sophie could still see the pair of them in the corridor talking to her mum and dad. "What did she say?" Miss Sissons said, without a hint of a smile. Sophie gave her a completely blank look. Normally she would trust Miss Sissons with anything, but there was something about her manner that wasn't normal. "Sophie, what did Clara say to you?" she said ever so slightly louder and firmer. This really took Sophie aback. How did she know? Did she trust her to tell her the truth about this? No, Sophie decided not yet, not when she was acting like this. "I don't know what you mean," Sophie lied. "When you passed out," Miss Sissons began, "you saw Clara and she gave you a message. What was it? Exactly, word for word." Sophie continued to plead ignorance. This teacher who she looked up to and admired and loved being taught by was beginning to scare her. "I don't know," Sophie implored, fighting back her emotions. "Don't lie to me." Miss Sissons was getting nasty now. Sophie was about to launch another appeal of her innocence, but was saved by the classroom door opening. Her parents had come to get her. "We're taking her home," Amelia said calmly. "It's been a busy day." Miss Sissons changed back to her normal, jolly self. "OK, Amelia. Now you make sure you're back in tomorrow, Soph, as we have even more exciting things to do." She glared at Sophie when she knew her mum and dad couldn't see her. "She'll be in," her dad started. "But there has been enough excitement for one day. I'm sure you'll take care of her, though, Miss Sissons. She does love being in your class." "I'll take care of her," Miss Sissons replied, and she looked at Sophie in such a way that she wanted to scream, but she kept it in. She was tough and wasn't going to let her see that she was getting to her. "Where's Lizzie?" Sophie asked her mum and dad. "Your nan came to fetch her a few minutes ago. I might go and get her later if this calms down a bit," Tom replied. After collecting her bag, Sophie and her parents left the classroom and headed out towards the cesspit of reporters that were waiting at the school's main entrance. "Sophie, we need you to prepare yourself," Tom started to say. "What for?" asked Sophie, clinging to her parents tightly. "Well," Tom began again, "seeing as the entire press conference was broadcast to billions of people all over the world, you are now, how do I put this, quite well known, and various people would like to know what happened from your point of view." Although Yasmin and Katie had let her know this already, Sophie thought it might get them into trouble if she admitted they had told her, and so decided to keep that from her parents. "What does that mean?" she said innocently. Before either parent could answer her, Mr. Houghton appeared in the corridor with Reuben standing next to him, looking decidedly cross. "They're everywhere," Mr. Houghton said, looking extremely pleased with himself, more so than he probably should, given that one of his students had just fainted in full view of the whole world. "Haven't they left yet?" Amelia asked, hugging Sophie even more tightly than she had been before. "No, they're all still outside, clambering for an interview with Sophie," Mr. Houghton replied. He had this huge smile on his face as if he was enjoying seeing the world's media focused on the school. At this point, Reuben was still looking cross and looked like he was trying to stare Sophie out. Sophie, on the other hand, was having none of it and simply stared through him. "They're calling you the Singularity because no one has ever seen anyone react like that to the implantation process," Mr. Houghton said to Sophie. Sophie thought about what he'd said. She hadn't seen the adult implantation process before. She'd read about it, and from what she had read, it seemed to follow a similar procedure, and also had never heard of anything like that happening to anyone. Reuben finally piped up. "Some of them are calling you the glitch. I think that's much more accurate." He said it all through gritted teeth in the corner of his mouth. He was clearly put out by all of the focus that Sophie was getting. "Where's Alton King? Surely he should be able to get rid of some of the attention," Tom asked. "He ran off as soon as Sophie was cleared off the stage," Mr. Houghton added. "And the entrance hall is crammed with journalists, and so is the hill leading up to school. You're going to have to go through them. If you need any help with what to say, then I can talk to them for you." "What about the police? Can't they help us out?" Amelia asked, starting to look desperate with worry for her poor girl. Ears suddenly pricked with interest. Reuben lost his stare at Sophie and said with huge smugness, "Oh, King was very adamant that the police not be involved. No crime has been committed." Sophie looked at him carefully. She was starting to think that Reuben was jealous of the attention she was getting. The Hardys then looked at each other. There was only one thing for it. They would have to barge their way through and get to the car that Mum and Dad had driven to school to come and get them. None of them liked the idea of fighting their way through a barrage of questions and flailing microphones, but they were going to have to. With that thought in mind, Tom and Amelia gripped Sophie's hand incredibly tightly, as any parent would. The door to the main entrance was swung open by Amelia, and the trio marched forwards. Lights flashed, chatter turned to shouting, and Sophie felt extremely claustrophobic. She did her very best to block out everything around her, but some things got through. "How did it feel, Sophie?" "What's happened, Sophie?" "How does it feel to be the most famous girl all over the world, Sophie?" Lots more questions were shouted in Sophie's direction, but she just held on incredibly tightly to her dad. Mum was in front, but still holding Sophie's other hand, clearing a path as best she could. The sheer number of bodies and the pressure began to take their toll on Amelia. She slipped slightly and just shouted, "Can you please give my daughter some space? She's still in shock at what happened." Some of the reporters took note of this and held back their questions, but others pounced on this opportunity to ask their questions. Sophie just wanted to scream and make it all stop, but being as determined as she was, she didn't. She knuckled down and forced herself through it. Eventually, Amelia reached the car, opened the back door, and Dad bundled Sophie inside. Sophie strapped herself in, and Tom did his best to shut the door. After a few goes and a few reporters' feet getting in the way, he managed it and got into the driver's seat. They sped off down the school driveway to the sanctuary of home. In the back of the car, Sophie had very quickly come to realise that being famous wasn't great. She wasn't like a superhero with a secret identity. The whole planet had seen this happen to her. She was a household name now. From now on, no matter how much she would will it not to, this morning would always be part of her, and this frightened Sophie immensely. She would always be the glitch or the singularity. She was tough, there was no doubt about that. With all the experience she had in her short life, Sophie knew that she couldn't let this get the better of her. Clenching her fists, she thought about what she was going to do next. There was, in her eyes, only one thing for it. Yasmin and Katie needed telling about Clara. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.